Go ahead.
I called it It's a Small World, after all, but I don't think that's the official title. I just have a couple quick announcements. I'm not actually running tonight. My friend Adam here is going to be running. He's going to be taking care of moderating. Adam actually ran our Slack tour a few months ago. For those of you that went on the tour, he's excellent knowledge of fundamental physics. We'll see how that translates to medicine. So I just have a couple quick announcements. This is my website, sciencecafesf.com. It's a home of Down to a Science. You'll find what's coming up and a blog. Sadly, a few days ago, Alex Barrel passed away. We saw him give a talk not more than a week ago at Cal Day. And there's lots of great information on the website, including what's coming up. Next month, we'll be here on the third Monday. It's going to be a talk on psychoactives and your brain. I'm calling it This Is Your Brain on Drugs. And we're going to talk about ecstasy and how it interacts with your brain in terms of neurochemistry and then social effects. There is a sheet being passed around. That's the sign up for my email. Rich, can you wave your hand? Right in the back there, that's Rich. He's passing around the sign-in sheet. Sign up for my email list. You'll get most up-to-date information on what's happening. And also you can sign up for Herb's email list. Herb, can you wave your hand? Herb maintains a list of all the informal science events in the Bay Area. He publishes a weekly newsletter. It's the best thing going if you want to have these kinds of conversations with science. So I encourage you to sign up for that as well. I've said just about enough. One last plug, and that there's a donation jar up front here. Donation bar. Thinking about my wedding again. There's a donation jar up front. This is all just volunteer run, and I just use the expenses to drink. No, I'm kidding. I use the expenses just to pay for advertising and a few other minor costs, and that's about it. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Adam. Oh, Herb, you have a question already.
I wasn't joking about that microphone. There's people up here. Who do you have for food? SEMA.
Oh, we have food announcements. We're going to take care of those right now.
That's classic. Oh my God.
PJ for a salad. Who else is looking for food? It's not science, it's food. Who's that? Okay, thanks.
Okay, so thanks everyone for coming tonight. Tonight we have Professor Tejal Desai, who will be talking to us about nanoscience. I'm sure you've all seen, well, that's why you're here. So, just a few things. I don't want to, toot her horn too much.
Hey, Adam, don't stand in the light. This isn't Poltergeist. We can't see you.
I just want to say a few things about Tejal, and she has been in the field of nanoscience before it was even called nanoscience. So she's got a lot of experience on what you're doing, and I don't know what all of you think about when you think about nanoscience, but one of the first things that pops to my mind is that book by Ray Bradbury called A Fantastic Voyage, where he gets in that little submarine and goes around in your veins and arteries. That's the first thing I think about nanoscience, which I think is probably absolutely wrong. But, but that's okay, and I think we'll get to that. I'm sure Tejal will tell me why I'm wrong, but I'm very happy to introduce her today. Again, if you don't know how we set up these talks, we'll have a talk by the speaker first, and then we'll have a bit of a question and answer session. So remember that we encourage questions. That's what this whole thing is about. It's to learn. It's to get someone who's an expert in the field to come out and just talk with all of us and share some of the knowledge. And I'm sure Tejal is very willing to answer all our questions. So remember that that's what we're here for. We're here to ask questions. First we'll have, first she'll give us a talk, then we'll have some questions, then we'll have a break so you can get some drinks and some food. So we're very fortunate to have the Atlas Cafe let us use their space, so hopefully you can buy some drinks and buy some food to keep us going here and let them like us so we can come back. So we'll have a break, and then we'll come back after the break and we can have some more discussion until we get tired and we have to close out. So without further ado, I want to introduce Professor Desai to talk about nanoscience.
All right, can everyone hear me back there? Yes, no. Talk a little louder.
Put the mic up.
Yeah, maybe.
Bring the mic. Perfect.
Great. Okay, so just to give you a little background, I'm actually a professor at UCSF in bioengineering. So I've always been at the interface between disciplines. So nanobiotechnology, engineering, medicine. I've always thought that the exciting things happen when you start to bring together disciplines. And so when I actually got my PhD at Berkeley, and at that time, a lot of people were doing what's called microtechnology, which we thought was incredibly small. And we started getting even smaller. And so a lot of the things I started doing after that went into what we call now nanoscience. But what I thought I'd start out with was giving you a little bit of a primer to what nanotechnology is, and then talk about why we're so excited about it for medicine, but also some of the big challenges, possible problems with going and using these technologies. And I really hope you can ask questions, either during my talk or after, whatever works for you.
It's doing sound.
It's doing. Okay.
Perfect. I think we're okay.
Better?
Yeah.
All right. So just to give you some perspective, what we're really talking about are thinking about designing devices or materials that are extremely small. And when I mean nano, it's something you really can't see with the visible eye. So if you have a piece of hair, it's about 100 microns. An individual cell in the body is about 10 microns. If you get smaller and smaller and think about sort of atoms and molecules, that's when you start talking about nanometers. So several orders of magnitude smaller than anything we could sort of think about manipulating with our hands. And why is that exciting? Well, if you think about biology, it really is on the same size scale as what I'm talking about. That is, if we go from individual cells on the micron scale to virus particles, to machinery within the cell, to DNA, RNA, ribosomes, things that actually make the body work, those are all nanoscale. And so when people started thinking about, okay, can we engineer things that begin to manipulate biology, or at least can probe biology, we thought, well, we need to develop tools that are smaller and materials that are smaller. And so people who are in the biological area are really excited about this. So at a basic level, what are nanomaterials? Well, here's a pretty simple example. If we have a nanomaterial compared to a microscale material, you may not be able to see it way back there, but what you end up getting with the nanomaterial is something which has a lot of surface area compared to volume. So as you begin to shrink things down, more of the atoms are sitting on the surface of that material as opposed to the inside of that material. So if it's something really large, your what we call surface to volume ratio is not as high as something that's really small. Why is that important? Well, it turns out that if you have a large surface, you're able to interact with the environment. So a lot of surface area allows you to interact with energy, allows you to interact with light, allows you to interact with things that are going to impact that material structure. So surface atoms interact more with the environment. And that's a really fundamental tenet of why nanoscale materials are actually different than just taking a big material and cutting it up or chopping it into pieces. You get some really unique properties. So For instance, if you have a nanoscale material, it responds to temperature in a much different way than something that's micro or macroscale. It responds to light, as I mentioned, and sound, thermal properties, vibrations, you name it. And that's going to be really important, because if we think about that, now we can start to think about, can we use these materials in ways that make them more detectable in the body, that make them more targetable, so we could guide them to places and then be able to see where they go, or make them create materials which have unique properties that we can't replicate in sort of normal engineering ways. So here's an example that a lot of people may or may not be familiar with, but these are things that are called quantum dots. These are small nanoparticles. So they're about 7 to 10 nanometers. And what's really interesting about these, they're little sort of metal particles, but when you get them to that size, what they do is they absorb one wavelength and then they emit another wavelength that gives it a very specific color. And as you change the size from 7 to 8 to 9 to 10 nanometers, every particle has an individual color that's unique to that size. So what's been revolutionary for these sorts of nanomaterials is the fact that now if you take this nanoparticle and you do what we call functionalization, or you put chemistry on it that attaches to a specific cell, you can begin to label cells in different colors. And so you can say, here's a tumor cell. It has a specific signature, and I'm going to target all the red particles to that cell. I'm going to target all the green particles to one that's non-tumor-like. And these are very stable materials, such that once we create a particular color, you can actually detect this both outside the body but also in the body. So we can see what lights up as being tumor specific and what isn't as being normal tissue. So that's sort of one example. We couldn't do this using conventional chemistry because the chemistry would get degraded away very rapidly, and we wouldn't be able to actually see things for long periods of time, enough so they could target whatever we're trying to get to. You may have heard of things like carbon nanotubes. What's the big deal about a carbon nanotube? It's actually made out of carbon, which we, of course, use every day, but when it's added in its atomic form in a really small tube-like structure, as shown right up here. So these are sort of tubes that have this helical pitch of carbon atoms. And again, they're on the order of a few nanometers in diameter. It turns out that this material has incredible properties that we don't see on the microscale or the macroscale. So, for instance, the density you have with this material, it's very strong, but it's extremely lightweight. So much like aluminum, but extremely tough, resilient, and can be actually somewhat robust under conditions which any of these other metal-like materials can't be. The tensile strength, or the amount of force it is to pull these things apart, is stronger than any of the highest strength alloys. But again, its form factor is on the nanoscale, so you need very little amount to get the same strength as you would in bulk stainless steel or bulk metal alloys that are used for bridges, suspensions, anything that's actually a structural element. So imagine now, if you want to create something that's really strong within the body, if you want to create new materials that are either used as protective clothing or used in automotive, airplane applications, or even implants within the body, you need things that are strong but also lightweight. And here we have a material that actually can do that. And there's some other really unique properties such as resilience and current capacity that are unique to really getting down to the nanoscale. So where do we actually already see nano? Actually, we saw nano way back in the early ages, 4500 BC, in fact, even older than that, where people used these quantum particles to actually color their glass. So a lot of the stained glass that we see in preserve structures in cathedrals, the light was actually emitted through these quantum light particles. Of course, we didn't know exactly what was happening, but that's sort of very early nanotechnology application. But we also see nanoparticles in things like tennis balls that give us balance and resilience. Already in tires, in sunscreen. So this is an example. Cosmetics and sunscreens have a lot of these nanoparticles which do interesting things from an optical perspective. So they give you translucency or give you coloring depending on what you want. Some are used to penetrate skin, some are used as protective barriers. I will tell you that also opens up a whole range of sort of ethical concerns, because we really don't know in some of these instances what is or what is not penetrating the body. So, I'd love to hear some discussion on that a little later on, because right now, nano-scale materials in sort of the cosmeceutical industry is not regulated, as opposed to when we think about drug delivery, which is really sort of a longer thing that's off. So the two things that we're really working on are thinking about nanotechnology for sort of two main applications. One is to replace damaged body parts. So looking at new implant materials, looking at ways that we can regenerate tissue. So if you have a heart attack, how do you actually get heart tissue that regenerates into the right phenotype, or doesn't become scar tissue but actually becomes functional? It turns out you can use nanomaterials to do a lot of those things, because cells respond to particular architectures in a very unique way. And probably more of an immediate goal is the delivery of therapeutics. So we're looking at ways that you can target cancer, deliver insulin, drugs for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, where we're not developing the drug, but we're really developing a way to get the drug where it needs to go and avoid toxic side effects of having a drug that's not targeted and packaged and actually get to the right place within a cell. So why are people looking at nanotechnology for drug delivery? If you look at how traditional drugs are delivered, essentially what you have is something that looks like this. You give a drug orally, you give a drug injectively, and drug goes everywhere, and you hope a little bit, and usually it's somewhere in the order of 1% to 2% actually get to where you want. So you actually give enormously high concentrations, even of things like aspirin, just to get the efficacy that you need to treat a disease. What nanotechnology has given us is sort of this hope where we can take the drug, package it into a particle or some sort of carrier, and actually be able to say, I want this drug to go specifically to the lymph node, to the liver, to X, Y, or Z, and not anywhere else in the body.
How does the nanotechnology affect that targeting?
So I will show you that in one second. But what it really does is it gives you ability to take a drug, put it into something, and then the actual material can be linked to chemistry, which can then get to that place. But if you didn't have this sort of nano packaging, you wouldn't have an ability to combine the targeting with the actual drug. So I think this was alluded to a little earlier, which is this notion of having a fantastic voyage or nanobots. And for those of you who can't see in the back, this is a little robot or submarine that's sort of swimming in the bloodstream, hoping to seek out and destroy anything that's bad. We're a long way off from that, but I would say that this is not far off with sort of where people are trying to go, in the sense that we'd like to create materials that are smart enough using both chemistry and material science so that they can seek out the good cells versus the bad cells, or the places where you'd like to deliver drug versus not. So an example of something that's considered nanotechnology are what are called Lemasomes. And this is actually an FDA-approved product. These are polymeric nanoparticles. They're about 100 nanometers. And they contain a pretty potent chemotherapeutic called doxorubicin. And if you take this drug and you just administer it systemically, you get high toxicity everywhere. But by encapsulating it into this little lipid polymer particle, you can actually preferentially have the drug contained and then targeted to the site of the tumor. And so this is just showing this is actually...
Turning your head, so you want to make sure it's back.
Sorry. So raise your hand if you can't hear me. So what this is actually showing you is that this person actually has Kaposi sarcoma, and so they are being administered these little nanoparticles that have doxorubicin, and this is a gamma scintillation graph showing sort of the lighting up of the tumor, and over about 96 hours, these particles actually target specifically to the places where the sarcoma is localized. So it's sort of showing you serially when you administer them, they sort of travel around and find the site which they've been targeted chemically to attack. So again, it's not, I would say there's some non-specific, but if you looked at this patient with sort of a normal regimen, the whole thing would be black. Drug would be everywhere, versus localized into these specific areas. So really, people are hoping that at some point you can create nanoparticles that not only get to where you want to get to, deliver the drug, but also can be imaged at the same time. So you have diagnosis, delivery, and detection. And it's probably really no other technology that would be able to package all of those components. Where this whole field is headed, and it's not something that's near term, but certainly a longer term opportunity is trying to target or travel to the sites that are, sites of disease, have some built-in intelligence. So because we make these things out of materials that are typically amenable to other fabrication strategies, there are investigators, including ourselves, looking at, can you track them? Can you actuate them? So once they're there, say, okay, now I want to turn them off and deliver the cargo, or have a safety measure. So let's say something goes wrong, you don't want all these particles just floating around. Actually have them made of materials where you can go in and then sort of collect them back up, either magnetic or photothermal, so you can ablate them. So there's a lot of different possibilities using these materials.
And the previous work, drug was concentrated on liver, but there was also, was that the spleen?
That was the spleen. So in fact, and we're going to get back to that because a lot of these particles, so the question was, were these particles that I just showed localized to the spleen? And in fact, the spleen and the liver end up being the last place that these things are going to collect. So that brings up again this sort of issue, what happens after the drug or the regimen is over? Do we have a lot of nanomaterials sitting in the body? Do they degrade? Do they harm long term? And a lot of this we don't know. And it's part of, at least what we're trying to study is what happens both on a basic level, but I think more is needed in terms of, again, where are we going to go with developing this material. Some other nanomaterial applications that we're interested in, these are all different versions of materials that have nanoscale features. So nanomembranes, nanowires, nanotubes. You hear about this, but why are they useful? Well, it turns out that each of these structures has really unique properties as well. So for instance, nanowires, as shown here, are really sticky. So if we put them onto a material, we can use them as tissue adhesives. And they're very good at sort of closing up wounds and being used as suture-like materials, but they have incredibly high strength. So we're investigating things like that. Nanopores, so shown here. These are pores that are down to about 10 nanometers and can be used in things like biofiltration, viral cleaning, so blood fractionation. A lot of times we've been using sort of conventional membranes that have pore sizes that are on the micron scale, And actually the things that we're concerned about, like viruses and pathogens, are generally nanometer scale. So again, they've been very useful as we get the size scale down to be able to really systematically block things in and out.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
I'm right here. Tejal.
Right there.
I'm just curious, when we look at these nanowires, like
Right.
pictures like this, if we put up a human hair
Right.
on
How
this
big
picture,
this-
like how big would that be?
So the human hair, there's a scale bar here that says 2 microns. That's this big. And a human hair is 100 to 150 microns. So basically the human hair is going to be, take up the whole
So
screen.
bigger than basically this whole room.
You got it. Yeah.
Okay.
So it doesn't seem real, but actually, it really is, and we can control exactly how these wires are grown, what the spacing of them is, how long they are, if there's an optimal length of them, so they become sticky if they're somewhat intermediate. If they're too short, they're not sticky. If they're too long, they flop over. So again, there's sort of the physics involved in all of this, and. Again, the list goes on, but of course I can't talk about it all. And one of the things we're working on in our lab, and as I sort of wind down, is the fact that you can take these same materials and you can load them on drugs and then actually take, for instance, a hip implant or a vascular stent material. So these are materials that are already developed in the body, but simply alter the outer structure of these materials so that you can get localized release of drug to bring down inflammation, to promote faster healing, to deliver antibacterial or antibiotic agents, in hopes that you don't, again, have to take the systemic therapy, but you can really focus the implant by using nanomaterials.
We have a question.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the, okay, one of the problems about prosthetic implants in orthopedics is that if it gets infected, there's practically nothing you can do because the artificial material is practically impervious to whatever. Would this be a way of dealing with that problem?
So that's exactly what it is. So there's 2 problems. One is infection, the other is loosening of the joint. So it turns out that these nanoscale materials, we can sort of control, you get very small amounts of drug over a 3 or 4 month period, so you don't have that initial infection. But the other thing is that these nanopores actually help bone grow into the structure, and so you don't need these glues which break apart over long periods of time.
They're not available.
No, they're not, although... so your traditional orthopedic companies are starting to actually develop these. So it's not, these sorts of applications, I'd say, are not long term. They'd be more 3 to 5 years. So.
I just want to interrupt for 1
Yeah.
second. Feel free, of course, to raise your hand and we'll come around with the mic if you, I'm sure we don't mind interruptions.
Adam's in the front, I'm in the back with a mic, so,
Yeah, so
raise
just
your hand anyway.
Really just raise your hand at any time.
So just getting into sort of the question that was asked about using these materials for implants, it turns out that nanomaterials have a really unique response when it comes to interfacing with cells. So if you grow cells on a flat material versus a nanostructured material, those that are nanostructured actually promote what we call differentiation of particular cell types. So we can make the structure to mimic something like the heart, make it mimic the endothelium or the liver, etc. And these cells actually respond to the nanotopography that we create. So this has enabled, again, a new area of research, which is called regenerative medicine, where we're developing materials that promote particular tissue reconstruction. So for those people who need to have damaged arteries or blood vessels or cardiac tissue, or sort of you name it in a way, including retinal tissue, which is a new area that we're looking at. If you put a nanomaterial with a specific architecture, grow progenitor cells, or even cells that have fully differentiated, the material topography actually can help promote a particular biological response. So this is just showing some of those. For instance, this is what we call a nano-grooved material down here. So these are little grooves, but we've created these little grooves because we're trying to mimic heart tissue, which grow in this sort of striated layer, muscle-like tissue. And it turns out if you grow cardiac myocytes on these nano-grooved material, you actually get contractility and muscle function, much like you do in vivo. So the material itself is actually promoting a particular function.
We have a question in the back.
Sure.
Okay, I'm a little confused. Are these living organisms or are they more like machines?
They are passive materials that we can interface with living organisms, but nanotechnology is not necessarily alive.
So there's no possibility of it like getting away and suddenly taking over?
It doesn't, and that's, it's important because, there are people who say, there are these, nanobots that are kind of come and colonize and do all of that. Everything that at least we work on, and I would say 99% at least of all the labs that I know are passive materials, and the only thing that they do that's alive is if we sort of incorporate them into a cell or something else that's actually already present in the body.
That does bring up nanotoxicology, though.
Exactly.
Is that something you're going to get to a little later?
I want to actually use that in discussion as opposed to slides, but it's in a big area, and that is exactly because all these particles at some point are either going to be put into the body, taken up, they either come out of the body or they get somehow metabolized within the body. So the whole area of nanotoxicology, I'm actually part of a UCSF task force to look at, for the state of California, what does that mean? Not just for medical purposes, but again, just like drugs that you take, the wastage goes into water, it goes into the soil, goes into the environment. What's going to happen to those nanomaterials?
It sounded like you were concerned about the potential issues that might be raised. It sounded like you were concerned about the potential issues that might be raised because there's an unregulated industry utilizing the technologies that they're not quite sure what the applications are going to mean. But, from a consumer standpoint, the idea of having, for instance, I use a powder that uses nanotechnology that reflects and has a beautiful application and feel. It's fantastic. And, looking at some of these, nanofibers and things, I can think like, poor Roto-Rooter or something, the idea of like having your skin cleaner than it's ever been or something. And, I think of all the teenage girls that have, complexion issues. And the idea of nanotechnology as an applicable science for issues that create psychological issues for people like complexion or some other issue that might be maybe sound more trivial when you compare it towards cancer or whatever.
Well,
but I mean on a real broad-based application, utilizing this technology in sort of really broad spectrum ways seems to be a wonderful thing. And I mean, as a consumer of nanotechnology at this moment, go nano.
Well, no, I think of course, I think it's great, go nano, but I think it's precisely the word unregulated in the sense that, where is the fine line between, okay, here I'm going to use it in my tennis ball versus my cosmetics versus I'm going to inject it into somebody and treat a disease. For drugs, it's very well regulated by the FDA. For nanomaterials that are sort of in contact with the body outside, you still may be taking up a lot of these particles, but,
You look good.
Yeah. Who knows?
But what's important?
Just have one more. One quick.
I just want to ask a practical question, more along the lines of Earth Day and eco-business, and wondering if you could talk about nanotechnology and its application to environmental sustainable business and climate change.
Yeah, so it is I think there's two sides of it, right? There's the toxicology side, which I think we don't know enough about, but at the same time, a lot of these particles have some very interesting properties in terms of binding heavy metals, in terms of being able to sequester toxins, looking at, again, nanomembranes for water filtration, for applications in a whole variety of sort of pollution, air quality issues that I think will be more effective, but also the fact that in some of these applications you need very little material. And so lowering both the cost of manufacturing as well as the material spent, if you can again use this much versus a whole to get the same strength and durability, I think we could win on that end. But there are again trade-offs.
One more question, sorry, Becky.
I may have missed it, but where do you get the nanomaterials? I mean, like the carbon tubes, the filtration?
We actually make them in the lab. So.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so how do we make them? So one of the things there's sort of two different approaches that people take to nano manufacturing, and one is you build up things atom at a time, and most of the processes we use are sort of thermal deposition processes. So we're in a big oven and we put in the different atoms that we're interested in, so oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and we actually build up materials one atom at a time. So those nanowires, for instance, you take a flat piece of titanium, flow in silicon and titanium or nickel or whatever material you want to make it out of, and they actually will grow these wires. And literally, you're growing them one atom at a time. The other way is top-down, where you start out with something really big, and you just sort of etch it away slowly until you get something that's really small. There are sort of pros and cons to both of them, but one gives you sort of control, that's atomic scale. The other one, you have less control, but it's much faster. So,
is this a chemical bond that forms the tensile strength?
What was that?
A chemical bond that forms this tensile strength?
Ultimately it is, because, there's sort of atoms that are covalently stuck together, so it's a chemical bond. But, again, the whole premise is that you have such few atoms that most of the surface area is exposed, and you really have this ability to now tune the structural elements of your material.
So just related to that, I wonder if it's more along the lines of, it's a lot of quantum mechanics that are going into this, right?
It's all quantum mechanics.
So we're talking like quantum chemistry and all these kinds of things, right? So it's not chemistry on some large scale, but it's actually the chemistry of individual atoms that are really holding everything together.
Right. So, if you actually look at the strength of two atoms together, it's extremely strong. We just don't ever think about it because most materials are billions of atoms. And so again, if you break things down to individual components, you get these properties that sort of come out.
Okay, we have one question up here.
Yeah, I have kind of a related question. And I guess this leads up to the questions about sustainability and environmentalism. Because nanomaterials exhibit different properties from when they're in their bulk size, can they actually be returned to their bulk size? Or is it like once you make a material nano, it's permanently nano?
That's an interesting question. I think you can make them back to bulk. So if you collect all of the nanomaterials and you actually then, again, sort of what I think is sort of the thermal processes that we use, you can actually get them down to their constituent atoms and reconstitute a bulk material again. But the efficiency of that would be really low. It would take a long time to do that.
Are the properties the same after that?
No, and they return back. So most of these materials are sort of reversible in the sense that once you get to the larger scale, you don't exhibit that as much.
Okay, we have one more question over here.
Sure.
Can these materials be made by bacteria or anything like that?
Yes. So.
Are they pretty much automatically produced?
No. So it's a very early field, and that's where sort of nano merges with synthetic biology, and I would say there's probably the first group of people who are starting to look at, can you have bacterial factories that actually produce some of these materials? So for instance, there's a couple of groups at UCSF who are trying to recreate spider silk, which is an extraordinary nanomaterial, has really strong properties, but the spider produces it in very limited quantities. So they're actually looking at engineering bacteria to produce this extremely strong nanomaterial in quantities that can be actually useful from a structural engineering perspective.
Okay, very good.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'm listening to you, and you're talking about the incredible strength of these materials, and I'm thinking environmentally, is it conceivable or possible to make containers or envelopes or have biological things generate these materials to contain such things as the nuclear waste and some of the other really toxic stuff that we might like to have contained and not leaching into the environment?
I think, gosh, that's a good question. I think it's possible. So, the examples that I know of that look at sort of creating high-strength materials have not done it for those particular purposes, but have looked at these materials for barriers, so you can make them, because certain materials are very impermeable, so you can make them sort of water resistant, and so we use those for fabrics. There's a lot of emphasis on sort of gear, whether it's for those people to protect firemen, to protect people who are potentially going into chemical warfare situations using nanomaterials, because again, the high strength, they don't. They're not going to rip, they're very, very durable, but also they have these abilities to have watertight shields that can't even get small molecules across. So I think that, potentially at some point could actually get scaled up, but, it's sort of, can we create enough of it in a reasonable quantity?
How would that be practical in clothing if people are, off-gassing? Methane and everything else,
right?
And fluids, and I mean, if you're sort of trapped and they're trapped in your suit, wouldn't that be extremely uncomfortable? So
it turns out that there are materials that, so some of these, in particular, these sort of nano porous materials where you have sort of bidirectional selectivity. So certain molecules can pass one way and other molecules can pass the other way. And so that's actually one of the things that's been really exciting about that. There's sort of
Gore-Tex.
Exactly. So it's Gore-Tex. In fact, Gore-Tex is in some ways a very early nanomaterial. It's not quite nano what we think of it, but the actual constituents of Gore-Tex, the way it's weaved, are using those fundamental properties.
So I want to get, I love all the questions and these are really good, but I do want to get back to the talk a little bit more so we can get finished up, but we do have one more question here because I promised that we would take it.
I only have one more slide that we can sort of
Since these materials are so small, what kind of tools do you use to manipulate them?
Yeah, so in fact, that's sort of a field in itself. How do you, how do you visualize them? How do you manipulate them? So we use a lot of electron microscopy, so large-scale, high-energy microscopes that are, so you really need a wavelength of light that's about the same wavelength to visualize these. The other thing we use is atomic force microscopy, so we have a very small tip that probes the surface and gives us sort of the inverse image of what we're trying to image, and we can sort of deduce what we're creating. So some of it is by direct visualization. Other things we sort of infer based on the structure and the properties.
But when you're trying to build something out of your knife suit, how do you move something from one place to another?
So we usually, with particles, we can suspend them in solution and we can sort of pipette them, and as long as they're in a slurry, it's very hard. We usually do our measurements not by how many particles are there, but what is the volume of particles or the mass of a large quantity, and then we'll dilute it serially to get smaller quantities. But for instance, in some of our studies, it's very difficult so we're trying to do a study where we're looking at targeting colon cancer using these types of particles. And we can't really go in and see how many particles are stuck to the cancer. We basically do this by imaging and trying to get a volume distribution of how much lights up within that tumor versus another place. So it's a sort of indirect way to get at this volume of particles that are a particular surface.
Tejal, when you get a question from the front without a microphone, can you restate the question?
Yes,
so we all
sorry.
get it? No worries.
No.
I think I inferred that was about the colon.
No, it was. So she was asking, how do you actually image these things, or how do you figure out what you have? And it's not always easy. But the electron or transmission microscopes can generally get us there.
Why don't we just let you get back to your... We'll take questions, but let's get a few slides in there first, okay?
So, I think the promise, as we sort of see it, is the fact that I've sort of illustrated a couple of things, but one, the nanoscale can really mimic the size scales of the biological world. So you can get things into places within the body that were previously inaccessible. But a lot of the things that we take advantage of are the fact that you have control over exactly what your material does with its environment. So the chemistry, the surface topography, the ability to take various forms of energy and actually convert it or have a signature that can be detectable. And essentially where we're really aiming for, and I think the whole field, is the fact that you can use these materials to get multifunctionality. So we're not just thinking about one material to do the targeting, one material to do detection, another material to actually treat the person, but really combining everything into a single platform. So that, to those who are in the medical field, are very, very exciting opportunities, filled with challenges, but the fact that materials at the nanoscale have many inherent properties that can actually do these already is a really big step forward. So, again, we can take any questions, and for those of you who can't see it, it says, where's the nanotechnology department? We actually don't really have a nanotechnology department, but you'll see that every department now, pretty much in universities, have a strong interest in getting people who can at least either understand, characterize, or develop materials ranging from biology to engineering, chemistry. It's a very multi-disciplinary field. So, wanted to get questions. I wasn't sure if we needed a break.
I think we'll take a few more questions if anyone has a few more questions.
I'll get to the one in the back here.
Okay, so.
And on the way, I'll ask a question because I have a little traveling to do. So I must have missed in the shuffle, what sort of exciting in your own department that you're doing research in terms of nanomedicine? Like, from the top down, what sort of disease are you going after, and how are you progressing?
So cancer is probably the big one that a lot of people are doing. We're actually, so we're interested in colon cancer is one area. The other area that we're looking at is how to get insulin in more, actually, an oral form of insulin using nanotechnology, so you don't have to inject yourselves, and getting it targeted, again, to the right area. We're also developing some ways that you can deliver drugs through the blood-brain barrier. So another place that's been notoriously difficult to get drugs into because most drugs don't penetrate. You inject them systemically and they have to make it all the way up to the cerebral arteries and veins to get into places to treat things like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, mental disorders, etc. And nanoparticles, if you design them right, actually can penetrate and actually take considerable payloads into those areas.
And a quick follow-up, real quick follow-up. And how is it progressing?
And how is it progressing? So it's progressing well. I'm still here, but I'd say it's a long road in the sense that a lot of what we've been doing in the last year has been really fleshing out all the toxicology and making sure that every material that we develop We know how it responds from inflammation, cytokine response, what happens to long-term exposure, short-term exposure, et cetera. So, in fact, we've sort of developed a lot of materials and applications, but now we've actually gone on and we've just, are about to publish 2 papers that really look at, okay, here are all the different materials that at least we work on in the lab. Here's their bulk form, here's their nanomaterial form, and compare them because we know the FDA-approved form is generally the bulk form. And so what differences are there between those 2 areas?
Yes, I have a question about the sort of response that got from the body immune system.
So yeah, so that's exactly what we're looking at. And so interestingly enough, so if you take a material that has a nanotopography on it, you actually get less of an immune response to that material than something that has a smooth, sort of topographic surface, which has been a sort of major finding from our perspective, because take the same material, same chemistry, you simply add nanotubes or nanowires or sort of change the form factor, and your inflammatory response actually goes down. So that's one component. So you have less scar tissue formation, you have less macrophage activation and cytokine response. On the other hand, for nanoparticles, there's an optimal size. So if you get too small, you get a larger immune response. If you get too big, you get a larger, but there is an intermediate size scale which the cells recognize combined but don't actually activate some downstream signaling that make it sort of a toxic invader. So all of our cells are sort of programmed to recognize certain size and certain chemistry. And so if you can design it within this ballpark to be close enough to the cell, but not something that actually triggers the cellular response.
Great.
You've mentioned antibiotics and bacteria, and I was wondering if there was anything in the works to target viruses, which are very much smaller, and it seems to be that might be a better target or a good target. There's no other way of getting at right now?
Yeah, so it is, it's actually something, so I was actually in a meeting today and they brought that same question up. So we haven't done that in our lab, but it really is something that could be amenable to what we're looking at. Antiviral therapy, and also just being able to do what we call viral capture, because a lot of these materials have high surface area. If you can use them as ways to actually almost grab viruses from a chemical perspective, we're looking into some of those things, but we definitely haven't done much in that area yet.
In the back here.
Thanks for a very nice presentation. I was interested in the aspects of drug delivery and targeting. You showed us the example of the Kaposhi's sarcoma patient and how the doxorubicin gets targeted to the tumor. Is this a specific targeting mechanism, and as a kind of second half question, you talk about your interest in oncology, and how do you handle the targeting? Is it specific for each tumor, or is there a general targeting?
Yeah, so there's...
Hang on 1 second.
Yep.
That's a really in-depth question.
That's a really in-depth question. So, no, it's not too in-depth. I want to hear what your background is.
Biologist. I'm a molecular biologist.
Yeah, so generally we still use antibody targeting. So, whether it's, sort of antibody specific, so whether it's HER2 or it's, any specific tumor directed antigen, we still use that, but we decorate the outside of the particle to then target the drug there.
We have a question.
So I'm wondering, what are the fundamental biology problems you run into? Like, what stops you to, make this a long-term project rather than, and especially in the genomic level?
So I think a lot of it is the fact that we we only get a snapshot of sort of how biology responds to either the materials or the treatment. So for those of you in back who didn't hear about what are our roadblocks in terms of the biology? And I think it's that, one, the field is still relatively new, and for us to really know how biology processes, what are the biological effects, etc., you can only do so much in a laboratory setting, and whether or not we need to have sort of the real-time data, which is not going to be done. And if you think about how long this field has been around, it's really sort of the last 7-8 years that people have started to look at this. So if we compare that to other fields that have matured, generally it takes about 40 to 50 years to really sort of see the maturation of a field in some of the biological sciences. So I think there's just a lot of unknowns, and that's sort of the roadblock. Not that it's a roadblock, but we have to sort of check off the boxes as we go there. Another thing is that a lot of the regulatory agencies, when we're developing products, just don't know really how do we treat this. Do we treat it as a new material? Do we treat it as a new drug? Do we treat it as what we call drug-device combination? It may be the same material that we've used for 50 years or so, which we can take titanium, which we've used forever, but now we're looking at titanium dioxide particles, and they're very different. And so I think we don't even know how to regulate this, and there's not enough people who know about the field to sort of provide the insight on all of these different levels: policy, science, toxicology, etc.
I have a question. It's going back to something you talked about when you used the example of cardiac muscle, and tissue engineering. So were you saying that the nanoparticles can take on cellular, they mimic biological structures?
Yeah.
They don't have organelles, though, right? They don't have.
No. I think I made too much of a leap in the sense that we don't actually use particles. There we sort of think about, we create sort of a material or a fabric that have a particular nanostructure on them. So they're not individual particles, but they are, for instance, surfaces that have nanowells or projections or topography that is very similar to the tissue that we're interested in. So what it does, it actually promotes cell growth and differentiation. So there's this growing body of literature that shows if you provide structural cues to a cell that mimic its native environment, so its native matrix. So all of the cells in our body are sort of suspended in collagen, in different nanoscale proteins, and if you can sort of recapitulate that, even if it's not the same material, the cell actually responds very similarly. We don't actually know why. A lot of it is sort of intracellular mechanics, but it turns out it is a very predominant behavior that happens, whether they're muscle cells, skin, neuronal cells, and so people are looking at, can you regrow neuronal connections? And if you provide the right sort of tubular geometry, the cells will again regain function. And so that's where nanomaterials come into play.
Hi, yeah. Going back a little bit to your FDA references, I'm just curious about the long term and how prepared is the FDA to deliberate these issues, and who are the big players in this, and who's ahead, the developers or the regulators?
So I would say, well, they're trying to get educated. I think there's a big push just to get enough people who know. I mean, so we're really just training the sort of first generation of scientists who have a good handle on what are the issues, what should they be, where should the concerns be, etc. So I think the FDA has their first problem is trying to get the people who know that on board. So I'd say at this point the developers are ahead, and so a lot of things are coming out and we don't know what to do with them. But on the other hand, we can't go much further until that gap. There's sort of a gap between, okay, here are things that we know a lot about, and here are things that we know very little about, and how do we get through that regulatory gap?
And they're talking about what are we doing to save energy in our buildings and try to do better public transit in our cities. And Mayor Miller, when it's her turn, throws a check down on the table and says, I want to stop the coal power plants. So if you guys all come together and do this with us, everybody throw in some money, we'll hire out the law firms, we'll get the NRPCs involved, we'll get all the other organizations involved, and actually make this a real political issue in Texas. I think we can do it. And it was actually in a little ICLEI meeting where all that stuff started. So that we're essentially a group that helps give cities the advice that they need to try to figure out how they can take action on climate change, and really provides a lot of networking opportunities to help build the political momentum that's caused you now seeing Time and Newsweek and all of these magazines are talking about cities and climate change, etc.
So let me add one thing to that, and that is that 10 years ago, the number of interesting new ideas for how to bring down carbon emissions was pretty thin. There was lots of interesting stories in sort of my big introductory energy class, but not a whole lot of theory. Suddenly, there's all these neat new ideas about how to do it. I mentioned this low carbon fuel standard, maybe at too much length for some of you, but this is an idea that didn't exist a couple years ago as a way just to think about our liquid fuels. Popped up, people said, let's try it, and it went incredibly fast from literally a spreadsheet a few of us had we were playing with to the law of the state that leads these things in the country, California. There's a whole bunch of these things going on. The city of Berkeley passed Measure G, which calls for them to get off of carbon entirely, except for the vehicles that pass through the city. They're giving themselves a little loophole for that on I-80, turns out. But city of Berkeley figured out in a meeting not too different than what Garrett's talking about, totally obvious when you say it, but revolutionary way to think about solving the biggest problem of photovoltaics, of solar panels. So, you all, I assume, have one of these, and the few of you who don't, I'm sure, are proud of it. But how many of you would have one of these if you had to pay for all of your minutes for the next 20 years up front? Probably pretty few. Right, maybe a couple closet venture capitalists in the back, but basically none.